37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. It is 11:43 p.m. The cabin is dark. Most of the 247 passengers are asleep. And then, without warning, the nose drops. Sound of alarms, rushing wind, gasping passengers. The aircraft pitches forward at an angle no passenger jet should ever reach. The altimeter is unwinding at 4,000 feet per minute. In the cockpit, both pilots are yanking back on the controls, pulling with everything they have. But the plane is not responding. And neither pilot knows why. Because somewhere behind the cockpit wall, hidden inside a maintenance panel that nobody had touched in 3 days, a single switch had been accidentally flipped to the wrong position. One switch. That's all it took. What happened next would shake the entire aviation industry and change the way aircraft are designed forever. This is the story of Pacific Continental Flight 217, a routine overnight crossing from Los Angeles International Airport to Tokyo Narita. The date? March 14, 2001. The aircraft, a Boeing 747-400, one of the most trusted wide-body jets ever built. Powered by 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines, capable of carrying over 400 passengers, with a safety record that airlines around the world relied on every single day. Flight 217 was supposed to be ordinary. 11 hours of open ocean, stars above, quiet passengers below. A crew that had flown this exact route dozens of times. The ticket agents at LAX smiled as they handed out boarding passes. The gate was busy with families, business travelers, students heading home. Nobody looked worried. Why would they? This was the 747, the queen of the skies. But something was already wrong, and nobody on that aircraft knew it yet. The weather forecast for the Trans-Pacific crossing looked clean. Departure weather at LAX, clear skies, visibility unrestricted, winds calm out of the southwest at just 8 knots. A perfect night to fly. The flight plan took Flight 217 northwest, over the California coastline, past the Alaskan chain, then sweeping down across the North Pacific toward Japan. Total distance, approximately 5,470 miles. Cruising altitude, 37,000 feet. Estimated flight time, 10 hours and 48 minutes. There was a weather system developing near the Aleutian Islands, a moderate low-pressure area with some turbulence reported by earlier flights, but nothing severe. The dispatcher cleared the flight without hesitation. The fuel load was calculated to precision, enough for the crossing plus reserves plus contingency, standard procedure. By every measure, every chart, every forecast, every checklist, this flight was a go. And at 11:07 p.m. Pacific Time, Flight 217 pushed back from Gate 42 and began its journey toward the runway. At the controls that night were 2 experienced aviators. Captain David Harrow, 54 years old, a 26-year veteran of Pacific Continental Airlines. He had logged more than 19,000 flight hours, with over 6,000 of those specifically on the Boeing 747. He was known among his colleagues as calm, methodical, and precise. The kind of captain who never rushed, never cut corners, and never stopped learning. First Officer Sandra Yee, 38 years old, a former U.S. Air Force transport pilot with 11,000 total hours. She had transitioned to commercial aviation 6 years earlier and quickly earned a reputation as one of the sharpest aviators in the Pacific Continental Fleet. Colleagues described her as unshakable under pressure. Together, they made an experienced, well-matched crew. They completed their pre-flight briefing at 10:42 p.m., reviewed the weather, discussed the fuel state, walked through the emergency procedures as required. Then they climbed into the cockpit, settled into their seats, and began working through the 60-point pre-departure checklist. Everything checked out. Every switch, every gauge, every system. Or so they believed. At 11:19 p.m., Pacific Continental 217 lined up on runway 24 left at Los Angeles International. The night air was cool and still. The city lights stretched out in every direction, millions of glittering points below the velvet black sky. Captain Harrow advanced the throttles. All 4 engines spooled up, a deep, rising roar that pressed passengers gently back into their seats. At 158 knots, V1, the decision speed, there was no turning back. At 168 knots, rotate. First Officer Yi called it out, and the nose rose smoothly into the air. Positive climb. Gear up. The 747 lifted off runway 24 left and began its long, graceful climb over the Pacific coastline. Passing through 10,000 feet, the crew reduced the climb power slightly, as required. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Flight attendants began their service preparations in the cabin. By the time Flight 217 leveled off at cruising altitude, 37,000 feet, it was 12:02 a.m. Captain Harrow and First Officer Yi exchanged a few words, settled into the long, quiet routine of an overnight oceanic crossing. The autopilot was engaged. The plane was flying itself. And for the next 2 hours and 17 minutes, nothing unusual happened at all.
It started subtly, the way most disasters do. At 2:19 a.m., roughly 3 hours into the flight, a small amber light flickered on the overhead maintenance panel. It was labeled Stab Trim Over 5 for 4 seconds, then went dark. First Officer Yi noticed it first. She pointed it out to Captain Harrow. He glanced at it. The light was off. The system showed normal. They reviewed the aircraft's maintenance log quickly. No unresolved write-ups, no prior issues with the stabilizer trim system. They discussed it briefly, decided it was likely an intermittent electrical glitch, common enough on aging airframes. They logged it. They would report it after landing in Tokyo. They moved on. But the light had told them something important, something they didn't yet understand. Because deep inside the aircraft's tail section, inside a maintenance access panel that had been opened 3 days earlier during a routine check in Los Angeles, a technician had inadvertently bumped a small black toggle switch. It was a switch that was almost never touched. A switch that bypassed the normal stabilizer trim limits and allowed the horizontal stabilizer to move far beyond its normal range. It was called the Manual Stabilizer Trim Cutout Override Switch, and it had been in the wrong position for 72 hours. At 2:19 a.m., for reasons engineers would later struggle to explain, that switch began to make itself known. At 2:41 a.m., the autopilot disconnected. Not gradually, not with a warning chime followed by a graceful handoff. It disconnected with a sharp clunk, and the aircraft began to yaw slowly to the left. Captain Harrow grabbed the controls immediately. He checked the instruments. Everything looked normal. Airspeed 498 knots, altitude holding at 37,000 feet, engines all 4 in the green. He re-engaged the autopilot. It held for 11 minutes. Then, at 2:52 a.m., it disconnected again. This time, as the autopilot released, the aircraft's nose began to drop. Not sharply, not violently, just slowly, persistently, as if something invisible was pushing the nose forward. Captain Harrow pulled back on the controls. The nose came up, but the moment he relaxed his grip, it began to descend again. First Officer Yi immediately called up the stabilizer trim display. What she saw made her stomach drop. The horizontal stabilizer,
The large, wing-like surface at the tail of the aircraft that controls pitch was trimmed nose down far beyond its normal operating range, and it was still moving. Slowly, steadily, driven by a system that neither pilot had commanded. Something was about to go terribly wrong. At 2:58 a.m., Captain Harrow made the call. "Sandra, I'm losing the ability to hold the nose up. Manual trim, now." First Officer Yi reached for the manual stabilizer trim wheel. She turned it. It moved, but the stabilizer didn't respond the way it should have. The trim had already moved so far out of range that the aircraft's aerodynamic forces were overwhelming the system. The nose began to pitch down, hard. In the cabin, passengers who were awake felt it first. A lurch, a sensation of falling. Overhead bins rattled. A coffee cup slid off an armrest and hit the floor. In the cockpit, alarms. The GPWS, Ground Proximity Warning System, screamed, "Pull up! Pull up!" The altitude was now 35,200 feet and dropping at 3,800 feet per minute. Captain Harrow was pulling back on the controls with both hands. The control column was shaking under the aerodynamic loads, forces so powerful that the physical effort required to maintain back pressure was like trying to hold back a wall of concrete. Passengers in the rear of the cabin began to scream. Oxygen masks deployed automatically. And then, the aircraft entered a 28-degree nose-down pitch attitude. For those 247 passengers, it felt like the plane was falling out of the sky. Because it was. In moments like this, training takes over where conscious thought cannot keep up. Captain Harrow, 26 years of experience distilled into instinct, made 3 decisions in rapid succession. First, he disconnected the autopilot completely and declared, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," on the emergency frequency 121.5. Second, he called for maximum thrust on all 4 engines, not to climb, but to maintain airspeed and energy state while they fought the trim. Third, he told First Officer Yi to pull the stabilizer trim cutout switches, both of them, which would electrically isolate the trim system entirely and stop the stabilizer from moving any further. Yi pulled both cutout switches. The runaway trim stopped. But the stabilizer was still locked in a nose-down position. The aircraft was still diving. They were now passing through 31,000 feet. Harrow was using every pound of force in his body to hold the nose up. Yi added her hands to the column beside him. Together, 2 pilots, fighting physics itself, they began to arrest the dive. 32 degrees, 26 degrees, 19 degrees. The altimeter stopped unwinding at 28,400 feet, nearly 9,000 feet below where they started. Slowly, agonizingly, the nose came back up through the horizon. The aircraft leveled off. The alarms fell silent. Captain Harrow's hands were shaking. First Officer Yi was breathing hard. Neither of them spoke for a full 7 seconds. Then Harrow keyed the radio. His voice was steady. "Tokyo Center, Pacific Continental 217. We've had a stabilizer malfunction. We are declaring an emergency and requesting divert to Anchorage International." In the cabin, it was chaos. Those who had been asleep woke to the sound of screaming and the sensation of falling. Carry-on bags had tumbled from overhead bins. Drinks had cascaded across seats. One passenger in row 42 had struck their head on the seat in front during the dive and sustained a concussion. Flight attendants, trained for exactly these moments, had grabbed the nearest seat handles the instant the dive began, bracing themselves. Now, as the aircraft leveled, lead flight attendant Maria Salazar made her way to the intercom. Her voice was calm, deliberately calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, the captain has asked me to advise you that we've experienced a mechanical issue with the aircraft. We are flying normally at this time. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Our crew will be coming through the cabin shortly." In seat 22A, a 34-year-old accountant named James Torrance later told investigators he had looked out the window during the dive and seen the ocean rising toward him. "I thought that was it," he said. "I genuinely thought I was going to die." 14 passengers were treated for minor injuries upon landing in Anchorage. Cuts, bruises, one broken wrist sustained when a passenger grabbed a metal armrest during the dive. It could have been catastrophically worse, and it almost was. Flight 217 landed safely at Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport at 5:12 a.m. local time. Emergency vehicles lined the runway. Passengers were met by airport personnel, medical teams, and airline representatives. Within hours, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, were on the ground. The aircraft was immediately impounded. No one was permitted near it without authorization. What followed was one of the most methodical and ultimately surprising investigations in recent aviation history. The flight data recorder captured every second of the incident with remarkable precision. The voice recorder documented every word spoken in the cockpit. Maintenance records were subpoenaed. Ground crew were interviewed. Every technician who had touched that aircraft in the previous 30 days was contacted. Investigators were looking for a cascade failure, a systemic malfunction, a software error. What they found was far simpler and far more disturbing. Inside the tail section maintenance bay, panel T7, accessible only through a small hatch near the horizontal stabilizer actuator housing, investigators found it. The manual stabilizer trim cutout override switch in the wrong position. Maintenance records showed the panel had been opened 3 days earlier by a technician performing a scheduled inspection of the stabilizer actuator assembly. The technician, a 12-year veteran with an impeccable record, had been working in the confined space of the panel with a flashlight and a torque wrench. At some point during the inspection, his arm had made contact with the switch. He didn't know it. The switch had no guard, no tactile indicator, no warning label visible from the working angle. When he closed the panel and signed off on the maintenance log, everything appeared normal. Because the aircraft's onboard systems didn't flag the switch position as an anomaly during ground testing, the 72-hour delay between the maintenance event and the in-flight failure was caused by a quirk in how the system operated. The override only began affecting the trim when certain autopilot modes combined with specific aerodynamic conditions at cruise altitude. In other words, it was invisible on the ground. It only revealed itself at 37,000 feet over the Pacific at 3 in the morning. What happened next shocked investigators further. When the NTSB reviewed the switch design specifications, they discovered it had been flagged in an internal Boeing engineering review 9 years earlier, in 1992, as a potential hazard requiring a guard or protective cover. The recommendation had been noted and then quietly shelved.
247 people boarded Flight 217, expecting to arrive in Tokyo. They landed instead in Anchorage, shaken, frightened, some of them injured, but alive. All of them alive. And that outcome was not guaranteed. In aviation, as in life, disasters rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with flashing lights and sirens. They arrive quietly. A switch nudged by an elbow in a dark maintenance bay. A recommendation ignored in an engineering review. A warning light that glows for 4 seconds and then goes dark. Captain David Harrow retired from Pacific Continental Airlines in 2007. In a rare interview given 5 years after the incident, he was asked what he thought about during those terrifying seconds when the aircraft was diving toward the ocean. He paused for a long time before answering.
"I thought about getting it back," he said. "That's all. Just getting it back." He did. But the question that investigators and the aviation industry were left with was not simply how Flight 217 was saved. It was how many other aircraft right now, tonight, might be flying with a switch in the wrong position. A condition invisible on the ground, a failure mode that only reveals itself in the dark, at 37,000 feet, over open ocean, when there is no runway for 1,000 miles in any direction. Think about that the next time you settle into your seat, buckle your seatbelt, and watch the ground fall away beneath you. Because the people in that cockpit are not just flying a machine. They are standing between you and the thing that goes wrong when no one expects it. And most of the time, you never even know how close it was.